It was 3:41 a.m. when Margaret Holloway was awakened by the telephone. The antique telephone, installed nearly 4 decades ago on her bedside table, emitted that shrill ringing that always made her jump. The thin curtains barely filtered the bluish light of the full moon, casting pale shadows across the room. She had always kept the same phone number. Waiting. Her wrinkled, age-stained fingers hesitated for a moment before picking up the receiver. Margaret knew that late-night calls never brought good news, but this one she had been waiting for 49 years. "Ms. Holloway, this is Detective Carson of the Oak Ridge Police Department." The voice on the other end sounded young and nervous. "We apologize for the lateness, but we thought you'd like to know right away." Margaret sat on the edge of the bed, her bare feet touching the tiled floor. She was 78 now, but her heart raced like a girl's. She clutched the medallion she never took off around her neck, a small golden angel with slightly crooked wings. "Did we find Susan?" The question escaped as a whisper, her daughter's name still aching in her throat even after all this time. "We've arrested Vernon Miller, ma'am. We have conclusive evidence, DNA." The silence that followed was filled by the ticking of the wall clock. "We're on our way to your house. We'd like to explain in person." The light rain falling outside tapped softly against the windows. Margaret hung up the phone and stood still, staring at a framed photograph on the opposite wall. Susan at 19, with shoulder-length brown hair, a shy smile, and dreamy eyes. Forever young. What began one July night in 1974, when her daughter didn't come home from a babysitting shift, was finally coming to an end. Oak Ridge, Kentucky, 1974. A small town surrounded by lush hills and dense forests, where the aroma of tobacco and coal permeated the air. Narrow streets lined with weathered Victorian houses, 3 churches, 2 pharmacies, a school, and the mine that employed half the local men. A community where everyone knew everyone by name, where doors were rarely locked, and where phones rang whenever a stranger crossed Main Street. Susan Holloway was 19 when she disappeared. She had just completed her freshman year at Kentucky State University, studying to become a teacher. She was the first in her family to go to college. During the summers, she would return home and babysit for several families in Oak Ridge, saving every penny for the next semester's expenses. Susan kept her money in a daisy-decorated cookie tin hidden in the back of her closet. She was a young woman with a soft voice and delicate gestures. She always carried a worn brown leather purse, a gift from her grandmother on her high school graduation day. She enjoyed reading poetry under the large oak tree in the backyard and dreamed of one day living in Louisville. Susan was patient with children, punctual with appointments, and kind to the elderly at the Methodist Church, where she sang in the choir on Sundays. Margaret was a single mother, working as a nurse at the small local hospital. Susan's father had passed away when she was just 3, leaving behind only a few faded photos and a faint scent of aftershave that no one remembered. The two lived in a modest house on Elm Street, with a narrow porch where they kept pots of red geraniums. The lace-curtained windows overlooked the municipal park, where children played on spring afternoons and couples met on Saturdays. The atmosphere at Oak Ridge was one of almost suffocating familiarity. Everyone knew when someone bought a new car, when a girl started dating, when a boy got a scholarship to college. Life flowed at a predictable, monotonous pace, marked by the mine whistle, the church bell, and the twice-daily train carrying coal north. Oak Ridge has always been a good town, Reverend Matthews would say during his Sunday sermons, a town of honest, hard-working people. That summer of 1974, a suffocating heat wave gripped the region. The asphalt melted under the scorching sun, and the air-conditioned Stanton's department store was a favorite refuge for ladies pretending to browse for dresses while escaping the heat. The local radio played Carpenters and John Denver between news reports about Watergate and the oil crisis. In the evenings, young people gathered at the drive-in theater on the outskirts of town to watch The Exorcist, screaming, huddled together in the back seats of cars. And then there was Vernon Miller, then 34, manager of the small local bank, member of the Lions Club, deacon of the Baptist Church. A respectable man, his hair always well cut, his suit impeccable even on the hottest days. He had a polite smile, a measured voice, and blue eyes that inspired confidence. Married to Eleanor, father of 2 boys, he lived in one of the most beautiful houses in town, a red brick building with a meticulously manicured garden. He donated regularly to charity, organized the annual Harvest Festival, and helped distribute Christmas baskets to poorer families. "Vernon is the kind of man who makes this city a better place," they commented. "A role model for our young people." On the evening of July 17th, Susan was babysitting the children of the Pattersons, a family who lived about a 15-minute walk from the Holloways' house. It was a hot and humid Thursday, and the sky promised a storm that never came. Susan was scheduled to return home around 11 p.m. after the Pattersons returned from dinner at the country club. The last person to see her alive was Mrs. Patterson, who thanked her for her service and watched as she descended the porch steps, her brown bag slung over her shoulder, disappearing into the darkness. Susan Holloway never made it home. Her route was simple: down Maple Street to the corner of Pine Street, turn right on Church Street past the Municipal Park, and follow Elm Street to 237, a route she had taken dozens of times before, without incident. Margaret spent the night awake, sitting at the kitchen table staring at the wall clock and the telephone. At 7:01 a.m., unable to bear the anguish any longer, she called the police station. Sheriff Tom Whitaker, a burly man with a thick mustache, arrived half an hour later, jotting down details in a small notebook with a pen that leaked blue ink onto his fingers. His face betrayed more concern than he admitted. "Maybe she met friends and lost track of time," he suggested without much conviction. "Or maybe I'm at a friend's house." But Margaret knew her daughter. Susan wasn't the kind of young woman who changed plans without warning, who went out with friends on weeknights, who ignored responsibilities. Her college backpack remained in the same place, her breakfast prepared the night before still untouched in the refrigerator, her toothbrush dry in the bathroom. Sheriff Whitaker organized the initial search that morning. Volunteers gathered in front of City Hall, divided into groups to search different areas of the city. Men with straw hats protecting them from the sun, women carrying thermoses of coffee and sandwiches wrapped in foil, teenagers eager for adventure without fully grasping the gravity of the situation. They called Susan's name through the streets, through the fields, along the banks of the creek that ran through the Johnson property. Nothing. On the third day, they found Susan's brown purse. It was partially hidden among the bushes on the side of the country road leading to the old quarry, about 2 miles from the Patterson home. The contents were intact: a wallet with $7.65, coral lipstick, a small mirror with a broken handle, house keys, a used bus ticket, and a book of Emily Dickinson poetry with several pages dog-eared. There were no signs of a struggle, no blood, no violence, just an abandoned purse, as if Susan had simply vanished into thin air. News of her disappearance spread like wildfire. The local newspaper splashed Susan's photo across the front page, headlined, "Young Woman Disappears in Oak Ridge. Police Investigate." The radio station interrupted its regular programming to provide updates on the search. Phones rang non-stop, with people reporting sightings of someone resembling Susan in Louisville, Lexington, and even Tennessee. All the leads turned out to be false. The community reacted as small communities often do, with a mix of genuine emotion and morbid curiosity. There were prayer vigils at the church, posters plastered across lampposts, and yellow ribbons tied to trees in the park. People who barely knew Susan suddenly had stories to tell about her kindness, her intelligence, and her promising future. The tragedy brought neighbors together, revived dormant faiths, and united the town around a common purpose. Margaret watched everything with a painful detachment. She saw the sincere concern of some, the veiled opportunism of others, the helplessness of all. He stopped going to work, could barely eat. He spent hours sitting on Susan's bed, caressing the pillow that still held the scent of her apple shampoo. At night, she left the porch light on, the door unlocked, waiting. The FBI was called in the second week. 2 agents in dark suits and grave expressions set up shop in the small police station. They interviewed everyone on Maple Street, Church Street, and Elm Street. They investigated Susan's past, her relationships, and her friendships. They checked to see if there were any known sexual predators in the area and if any outsiders had been seen in the days before her disappearance. Vernon Miller was one of those interviewed, like all the other prominent members of the community. He sat upright in his police chair, answering each question calmly and precisely. He said he knew Susan by sight, that he greeted her when he met her on the street or at church, but nothing more. He offered to organize a fundraising campaign to help with the search. The officers thanked him and took his statement without giving it any further importance. The investigation dragged on for months without significant progress. Theories abounded. Susan had run away to start a new life, far away. Susan had been kidnapped by a passing motorist. Susan had been in an accident, and her body was somewhere in the dense woods surrounding Oakridge. Each possibility was more heartbreaking than the last. In December of that year, with the arrival of the harsh winter, the official search was suspended. Susan's photo on the newspaper's front pages was replaced by news about rising gas prices and special Christmas programming. The yellow ribbons faded and tore from the wind and snow. People stopped mentioning the case in Margaret's presence, as if silence could lessen her pain. Vernon Miller was one of the few who continued to visit Margaret regularly. She brought her meals prepared by Eleanor, offered to fix small things around the house, and sat at the kitchen table talking about Susan. He organized the annual vigils on the anniversary of her disappearance, keeping the young woman's memory alive in the community. "We won't give up," he said, holding Margaret's trembling hands in his. "The truth always comes out sooner or later." Life in Oakridge went on as usual. The mine closed in 1982, leaving dozens of men without jobs. Stanton's department store was replaced by a national chain. A shopping mall was built nearby, and the downtown area began to wither. Sheriff Whitaker retired in 1985, replaced by an ambitious young man from Louisville who promised to modernize the local police force. Reverend Matthews died of cancer. The drive-in closed and the train stopped running. Decades piled up. Margaret grew old alone in that house on Elm Street, where she kept Susan's room exactly as it was the day she disappeared. Posters of Cat Stevens and Simon and Garfunkel on the walls, a patchwork quilt on the bed, a porcelain doll that had belonged to her grandmother sitting in the rocking chair. Each birthday, each Christmas, each Easter was a new layer of absence superimposed on the last. Vernon Miller prospered. He became president of the bank, then opened his own financial consulting firm. His children grew up and moved to larger cities. Eleanor developed early-onset Alzheimer's and passed away in 1997, leaving him a widower. Gradually, he became a sort of patriarch of Oakridge, respected for his generosity, his active community involvement, and his loyalty to that small town that so many young people abandoned in search of better opportunities. In 1999, 25 years after Susan's disappearance, the case was officially closed. Margaret received a formal call from the police department informing her that, although the file was technically still open, there were no longer any resources dedicated to the investigation. It was suggested that she consider holding a symbolic funeral to gain some kind of closure. Margaret hung up the phone without answering and smashed 3 plates against the kitchen wall. The only time she lost control in all those years. It was that same year that Sheriff Ryan Matthews, no relation to the late Reverend, newly sworn in and determined to digitize the department's old files, came across the Holloway case. Fascinated by the story, he began revisiting the material in his spare time. He re-interviewed some living witnesses, visited the locations mentioned in the reports, and studied the photographs yellowed with age. In 2001, a new DNA analysis technique began solving cold cases across the country. Sheriff Matthews sent Susan's purse to a specialized laboratory, hoping to find some previously unidentified trace. Weeks later, he received the results. There was genetic material on the purse's inner strap, barely visible but sufficient for analysis. A partial profile was obtained, but with no match in any known database. The years continued to pass. Margaret developed arthritis, requiring a cane to get around, then a wheelchair. Her hair, once brown like her daughter's, turned completely white. The wrinkles deepened on her face, but her eyes remained alert, lively, hopeful. She kept the same phone number, the same address, as if any change would mean Susan wouldn't know how to find her if she returned. In 2015, the old quarry was finally closed, and the land sold for a real estate development. During earth-moving work, workers discovered human bones buried approximately 2 meters deep. Work was immediately halted, the area cordoned off, and forensic experts were called to the scene. The remains belonged to a young woman estimated to be between 18 and 25 years old, who had died several decades earlier. The skeleton was nearly complete, except for a few phalanges and the bones of 1 foot. Alongside the remains, they found a small golden angel with slightly crooked wings, identical to the one Margaret had worn around her neck since her daughter's disappearance. It was a set. Susan wore one, and her mother the other, Christmas gifts from 1973. The DNA identification was conclusive. The remains belonged to Susan Holloway. After 41 years, she had finally been found. The case was reopened with top priority. A new team of state investigators arrived in Oak Ridge. Former residents were re-interviewed, files reviewed, and evidence reanalyzed. The partial DNA profile found in the purse in 2001 was compared to samples voluntarily collected from dozens of men living in Oak Ridge at the time of the disappearance. Vernon Miller, then 75, a respected pillar of the community, grandfather of 5, and president emeritus of the local Chamber of Commerce, initially refused to provide a sample. He cited issues of principle and privacy. When he finally gave in to pressure, the results were conclusive. The DNA found on Susan Holloway's purse was his. Police obtained a search warrant for his property. In a secret compartment in the basement floor, they found a metal box containing several items. Susan's wristwatch still working, a few locks of brown hair carefully tied with ribbons, newspaper clippings about the disappearance, and a diary in which Miller described in disturbing detail his obsession with the young woman, how he followed her that July night, how he approached her offering a ride, and how he reacted when she refused. In the early hours of September 12, 2023, almost 50 years after the crime, Vernon Miller was arrested at his home. The police car parked silently in the driveway, lights off. There was no resistance. The man who had comforted Margaret for decades, who organized vigils, who presented himself as the guardian of Susan's memory, emerged in handcuffs to the astonished gaze of neighbors who had gathered in robes and pajamas, awakened by the unusual commotion. The news fell like a bombshell on Oak Ridge. Television stations sent crews, reporters gathered outside the police station, and the case made national headlines. Community pillar arrested for 1974 murder. Banker hides crime for half a century. The Oak Ridge monster. The same people who had admired Vernon for years, trusted him, followed his example, now revisited every interaction, every conversation, searching for signs they had missed. The entire town entered a kind of collective and confused mourning, not only because of the confirmation of Susan's death, which many had accepted for years, but because of the betrayal, the lie, the discovery that evil had walked among them, smiling, a part of their lives, while hiding a terrible secret. The certainties of a small rural town were irreparably shaken. In his testimony, Miller finally confessed. He admitted to having developed a fixation with Susan months before the crime, observing her at church, at the bank, and on the streets. That July night, he followed her in his car after she left the Patterson house. He offered her a ride, which she politely declined. He persisted. When she started to walk away, he forcibly pulled her into the vehicle. He took her to the area near the quarry where the assault took place. He then buried the body, hid the purse, and returned home, where Eleanor slept with her children. "Why did you stay close to Margaret all these years?" the investigator asked incredulously. "To know what the police knew," Miller replied flatly. "And because I felt I'd connected to Susan through her." The trial was brief. The evidence was irrefutable, the confession detailed. Vernon Miller was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. At 75, he knew he would die behind bars. Margaret watched it all with dignified silence. Sitting in her wheelchair in the courtroom, her wrinkled hands tightly clutching the angel medallion, she watched the man who had stolen her daughter, her peace, her decades, the man who later offered to comfort her, who entered her home, who ate at her table. Her eyes met his only once during the entire proceedings. There was no hatred, only infinite sadness. "I'm tired," she told reporters gathered on the courthouse steps. "I've waited for this day for so long I've forgotten what it's like not to wait." On a cold autumn morning, Susan Holloway was finally laid to rest in the small Oak Ridge Cemetery. The ceremony brought together hundreds of mourners, including many who hadn't even been born when she disappeared, but who had grown up hearing her story. The casket, too small to contain her absence of nearly 5 decades, was lowered into the earth under a light rain, reminiscent of the one on the night the phone rang in the Holloway house. Margaret, now 78, watched everything with weary eyes. Beside her, sitting silently, was Sheriff Matthews, now retired, the man who never gave up on the case. His hair had turned grey, deep wrinkles marred his face, but his watchful gaze remained the same. He held a small worn notebook, where years before he had written, "Someday the truth." The current reverend, too young to have known Susan, spoke of divine justice, of Job's patience, of the comfort that would come with acceptance. But Margaret sought neither comfort nor acceptance. She simply wanted the world to know that her daughter existed, that she was loved, that she was missed. Susan would have been 68 today, she said, when it was her turn to speak. Her voice was weak but clear. She could have been a teacher, a mother, a grandmother. She could have traveled, written poems, planted a garden. All those possibilities were buried with her. But she lived. For 19 years, she lived and laughed and loved and dreamed, and no one can take that away from her. After the funeral, Margaret was taken back to the house on Elm Street. She asked to be alone for a while. She sat on the porch looking out at the park where children still played, where couples still met on Saturdays. Life went on as it always had. The telephone never frightened her again. The shrill sound that for decades had made her jump, both hopeful and terrified, was now just the echo of a time that was finally over. Margaret knew she wouldn't live much longer, and for the first time in nearly 50 years the thought didn't terrify her. Susan had been found. The truth had emerged from the shadows. She could finally rest. Susan's room remained intact, a silent memorial. The house on Elm Street, with its narrow porch and lace curtains, a testament to so much pain and longing, became a symbol for the residents of Oakridge. Younger generations passing by would point with reverence. "It's Mrs. Holloway's house," they explained to visitors, "the mother who never gave up." Decades may silence voices, but they cannot bury the truth forever. At some point, secrets emerge from the depths. Bones reveal themselves beneath the disturbed earth. The past returns to demand recognition. In Oakridge, Kentucky, a mother waited nearly 50 years to bury her daughter. A community discovered that evil can wear the face of virtue. And a 19-year-old girl, who dreamed of being a teacher, finally found justice. How many Susan Holloways are still waiting to be found? How many Margaret Holloways are still waiting for the phone to ring in the wee hours of the morning? Stories like this are still waiting to be told, so that none of them are forgotten.